On the morning of October 25, 1944, a Japanese Zero appeared above the escort carrier USS St. in the Leyte Gulf. Every anti-aircraft gun on the ship opened fire. The 20mm Oerlikons, the 40mm Bofors, the 5-inch guns. Every barrel that could elevate tracked the incoming aircraft and fired. The gunners were trained. The fire was sustained. The volume of metal going into the air was significant by any measure of anti-aircraft gunnery that the United States Navy had used to evaluate its fleet air defense capability for the previous 3 years. The Zero did not turn away. It did not break off its approach. It flew through the fire, reached the flight deck, and detonated its bomb. St. Lo sank in 30 minutes. She was the first ship in history to be sunk by a kamikaze. She would not be the last. In the 6 months between that October morning and the end of the Pacific War, kamikaze attacks damaged or sank more than 400 American naval vessels. Nearly 5,000 sailors were killed. The most intensive anti-aircraft gunnery effort in naval history, a fleet that had been building, training, and equipping for aerial threats since Pearl Harbor, found that the doctrine it had developed and the weapons it had built were inadequate against an adversary that had solved the targeting problem by removing the pilot's interest in survival. The gun-based air defense doctrine of 1944 was not stupid. It was not under-resourced. It was obsolete. And the United States Navy knew it on the morning St. Lo went down. The question was what to replace it with. The answer? Developed across 8 decades of continuous technological reinvention, 4 distinct strategic eras, and a series of capability transitions that each required discarding assumptions that had seemed unquestionable, is the most consequential story in the history of American naval warfare that most people who follow American naval warfare have never fully traced from beginning to end. The first transition began while the Pacific War was still being fought, powered by a technology so significant that it remained classified for years after the war ended. The proximity fuse, a miniaturized radar transmitter embedded in the nose of an artillery shell that detonated the round when it came within lethal fragmentation range of a target without requiring a direct hit, transformed anti-aircraft effectiveness in ways that no improvement to training or volume of fire could have matched. Before the proximity fuse, an anti-aircraft shell had to hit the aircraft or detonate close enough by time fuse, set before firing, based on estimated altitude and range, to be lethal. The hit probability was low. The time fuse required accuracy in setting that combat conditions made difficult. The result was a low probability of kill per round that demanded enormous volumes of fire to achieve acceptable aggregate results. The proximity fuse changed the kill probability per round by an order of magnitude. It did not require a hit. It did not require precise fuse timing. It detonated in the lethal radius of the target, regardless of whether the shell passed above, below, or to the side, as long as it passed close enough. Against conventional aircraft, this was transformative. Against kamikazes, it was meaningfully better, but still insufficient, because a kamikaze that was already within seconds of impact, when it entered the fuse's lethal radius, had already achieved its tactical objective, even if the warhead detonated. The proximity fuse was the last major improvement available within the gun-based doctrine. When the war ended, the Naval Research Laboratory and the Office of Naval Research both understood that the gun era of fleet air defense was finishing. The threat had evolved past the solution the gun could provide. What came next would have to be fundamentally different. The surface-to-air missile was the conceptual replacement. A weapon that could chase a target across the sky, guided to intercept by a radar beam or by its own internal seeker, capable of engaging targets at ranges and altitudes that guns could not reach, and at closing speeds that made time fuse accuracy irrelevant. The Navy began developing its SAM programs in the immediate post-war years, and by the early 1950s had committed to 3 parallel programs addressing 3 distinct threat ranges, a decision that reflected both the genuine diversity of the threat environment and the institutional politics of 3 separate Navy Technical Bureau, each wanting authority over their own program. The 3 T-SAMs, Terrier for medium range, Talos for long range, and Tartar for short range, were the first generation of American naval surface-to-air missiles. USS Boston, converted from a heavy cruiser, became the first surface ship to carry SAMs when she was recommissioned in 1955, with a Terrier system replacing her aft 8-inch gun turrets. The philosophical shift was significant. Instead of projecting a volume of metal and hoping for sufficient hits, the missile-armed ship was projecting a guided weapon specifically designed to maneuver toward its target and detonate in close proximity. The probability of kill per engagement was dramatically higher than anything the gun era had achieved. The 3T systems had their own limitations. Each missile required a dedicated tracking radar beam to guide it to the target, a continuous wave illumination that occupied the tracking radar for the duration of the engagement. Against a single aircraft, this was manageable. Against 2 aircraft simultaneously, the ship needed 2 tracking channels. Against 4 or 8 or 24. The scenarios that Soviet long-range maritime aviation doctrine was developing around AS-4 kitchen anti-ship missiles in coordinated backfire bomber strikes. The single channel per target architecture of the 3T systems created an engagement capacity ceiling that the threat environment was moving well past. The cold mathematics were alarming. A Soviet backfire bomber regiment of 16 aircraft, launching 2 AS-4 missiles each, could put 32 supersonic anti-ship missiles in the air simultaneously. A Talos-equipped cruiser could engage at most a handful of them before the rest were inside minimum engagement range. The 3T doctrine worked against the threat it was designed for. It was breaking against the threat the Soviets were building toward. The Navy needed a different engineering philosophy. The engineering philosophy that replaced the 3T systems was the most ambitious weapons system development program the United States had ever attempted, and it worked in a way that its most optimistic designers probably did not fully expect when they committed to the concept. AEGIS, a name drawn from the shield of the Greek god Zeus, which deflected all weapons, was conceived in the late 1960s as a solution to the multiple simultaneous target problem that the 3T systems could not address. The core insight was that the limitation on simultaneous engagements was not the missile or the warhead or the ship's magazine. It was the radar. If a ship could only illuminate one target at a time, it could only engage one target at a time, regardless of how many missiles it carried. Solving the air defense problem at scale required solving the radar problem first. The AN/SPY-1 phased array radar that became AEGIS's primary sensor was a fundamental departure from every previous naval radar architecture. A conventional rotating radar scans the horizon by physically spinning a reflector antenna, covering each portion of the sky in sequence, providing one look per rotation. A phased array has no moving parts. It consists of thousands of individual antenna elements, each capable of transmitting and receiving independently, controlled by a computer that can steer the radar beam electronically in any direction in microseconds. Where a rotating radar looks at each sector of sky once per rotation, a phased array can look at multiple sectors simultaneously, tracking existing contacts while searching for new ones, managing multiple simultaneous engagement fire control solutions, and doing all of it at electronic speed rather than mechanical speed. The SPY-1 was paired with a computing architecture, the ANYK-7, and then the ANYK-43 tactical computers that could process the radar's data and manage simultaneous engagements at speeds no human operator could match. The system tracked contacts. The system assessed threats. The system recommended engagements. The operators provided oversight and authorized actions. For the first time in naval air defense history, the ship's engagement capacity was limited by the magazine, by how many missiles it carried, rather than by the tracking radar's ability to manage simultaneous engagements. The development program ran from the late 1960s through the early 1980s. Over a decade of engineering, testing, integration, and refinement that cost approximately $1 billion in 1970s dollars and produced a software architecture of extraordinary complexity. The software that ran AEGIS at its initial deployment was among the most sophisticated real-time operational software ever written, managing sensor data, threat assessment, engagement sequencing, and missile guidance simultaneously across multiple simultaneous engagements in a tactical environment where the time available to make decisions was measured in seconds. U.S. Ticonderoga, CG-47, was commissioned on January 22, 1983. She carried the first operational AEGIS combat system. The U.S. Navy had its answer to the saturation attack problem. It had taken 40 years from the kamikaze to get there. The battlefield adaptation of AEGIS across the Cold War and the post-Cold War period is a story of a system that was constantly being tested against a threat environment that was constantly evolving, and that adapted each time with a combination of software upgrades, new missile variants, and doctrinal refinement that kept it ahead of the threat in every era except the current one. The Cold War deployment of AEGIS was against a Soviet threat that existed in planning documents and exercises rather than in live combat. American and Allied AEGIS ships participated in exercises that simulated the backfire saturation scenarios the system had been designed for, demonstrating engagement capacities against simultaneous targets that the 3T systems could never have matched. The exercises validated the system's core performance. They did not validate it in the way that combat validates a weapons system against a real adversary in conditions that training exercises only partially replicate. The first real test came not from the Soviet Union but from a civilian airliner. On July 3, 1988, USS Vincennes, CG-49, an AEGIS cruiser operating in the Strait of Hormuz, shot down Iran Air Flight 655, a civilian Airbus A300 carrying 290 passengers and crew. The crew of Vincennes, operating in a high-tension environment during an active engagement with Iranian gunboats, misidentified the aircraft as an attacking Iranian F-14. The AEGIS system tracked the aircraft accurately. It provided the crew with all the information they needed to make a correct identification. The crew made the wrong decision under pressure in an environment where the distinction between a climbing civilian airliner and a descending attacking military aircraft was ambiguous in real time in ways that training had not fully prepared them for. The Vincennes incident was not a failure of AEGIS as a weapons system. It was a failure of the human-machine interface, the point at which a system tracking hundreds of contacts simultaneously delivered information to human operators managing a live combat situation under time pressure. The lesson was that the most sophisticated air defense system ever built could amplify human error as well as human capability, and that doctrine, decision-making processes, and training for ambiguous scenarios required continuous development alongside the hardware. The Gulf War deployed AEGIS ships to the Persian Gulf. The air threat they were designed for did not materialize. AEGIS ships participated in the coalition air defense architecture without facing their primary engagement scenario. What the Gulf War demonstrated instead, through Princeton and Tripoli, was that the most sophisticated air defense capability in the world did not protect against every threat dimension, a lesson that has echoed through mine warfare doctrine discussions ever since. The post-Cold War period produced the most consequential adaptation in AEGIS's history because it required the system to evolve in a direction its original designers had never planned for. The transformation of AEGIS from a fleet air defense system into a ballistic missile defense platform is the engineering evolution that defines the current strategic role of the cruiser and destroyer fleet. And that has made AEGIS simultaneously more strategically important and more operationally complicated than any previous generation of its development. The ballistic missile threat that drove this evolution was not the Soviet intercontinental ballistic missile against which national missile defense programs had been debating since the 1960s. It was the theater ballistic missile, the Scud variants, the Nodong, the Shahab, the DF series weapons of the North Korean and Iranian and Chinese programs, that presented a threat to American forces, allies, and interests in regional contingencies that the 3T era doctrine had no answer for, and that AEGIS, in its initial configuration, was not designed to address. Intercepting a ballistic missile is a qualitatively different problem from intercepting an aircraft or a cruise missile. A ballistic missile travels on a predictable ballistic trajectory from launch to the apex of its arc, and then descends toward its target at velocities that can exceed Mach 15. In the terminal phase, the final seconds of descent, the missile is moving too fast, and the engagement window is too short for any intercept that requires the interceptor to travel significant distance to the intercept point. The intercept has to happen either in the ascent phase, before the missile reaches its apex, or in the mid-course phase, in space, above the atmosphere, during the ballistic arc. The Standard Missile-3 was developed specifically for the mid-course intercept mission. SM-3 is a hit-to-kill interceptor. It carries no explosive warhead. It destroys its target by the kinetic energy of a direct collision, which requires guidance accuracy measured in centimeters at intercept points, occurring at altitudes of hundreds of kilometers and closing velocities of several kilometers per second. The engineering precision required to build a weapon that reliably achieves this in operational conditions, in darkness, against targets with countermeasures, at ranges and altitudes that exceed the atmosphere itself. represents a level of technical achievement that puts the SM-3 program alongside the Apollo program as a demonstration of what systematic American engineering investment can produce. On February 21, 2008, USS Lake Erie, CG-70, an AEGIS cruiser, successfully intercepted USA-193, a failing American reconnaissance satellite, at an altitude of 247 kilometers. The intercept demonstrated that AEGIS could operate effectively not just as a fleet defense system, or a theater missile defense system, but as a space interceptor capable of engaging objects in low Earth orbit. The engagement was also the first operational demonstration of a capability that the world's space powers took careful note of: the ability to destroy satellites with a system that any AEGIS ship carries as a standard weapon. AEGIS ashore extended the system beyond the ocean entirely. Land-based installations at Deveselu in Romania and Redzikowo in Poland deploy the same radar and missile systems as the ship-based configuration, providing persistent ballistic missile defense in the European theater without requiring ships on continuous station. The same architecture functions identically ashore and at sea, a deployment flexibility no previous air defense system had offered. If the evolution from kamikazes to ballistic missile defense is the story of a doctrine that reinvented itself 4 times in 80 years, each time faster than the previous iteration, each time against a more demanding threat, then the future transformation of AEGIS is the story of a system facing the most technically demanding reinvention it has yet encountered. The hypersonic glide vehicle is the weapon that is forcing AEGIS's next evolution, and it is doing so on a timeline that creates genuine concern among the engineers and operators who understand the engagement mathematics. A hypersonic glide vehicle is not simply a faster ballistic missile. It travels at speeds between Mach 5 and Mach 20, but unlike a ballistic missile, it does not follow a predictable ballistic arc. It glides, maneuvering through the upper atmosphere along a trajectory that can shift horizontally as well as vertically, approaching from directions that are not the straight-line extrapolation of its initial launch vector, and doing so at altitudes that are below the optimal engagement envelope of the SM-3, and above the optimal engagement envelope of the Standard Missile-6's terminal defense capability. The engagement timeline for a hypersonic glide vehicle detected at 400 kilometers at Mach 10 is approximately 80 seconds from first detection to impact. In 80 seconds, the AEGIS engagement sequence, radar detection and classification, track establishment, threat assessment, engagement decision, interceptor launch, interceptor flyout to the intercept point, must be completed. Each step in that sequence has a minimum time requirement driven by physics and processing speed. At Mach 10, those time requirements are not comfortable. The Standard Missile-6, the current frontline air defense missile in the AEGIS fleet, can intercept hypersonic threats in their terminal phase, the final seconds of approach when the vehicle has descended to lower altitudes. The engagement window in terminal phase against a Mach 10 vehicle is measured in seconds. Success requires a narrow intercept geometry, precise tracking, and an engagement sequence that leaves almost no margin for the processing delays, human decision time, or fire control solution uncertainty that the real operational environment inevitably introduces. The glide phase interceptor, being developed to engage hypersonic glide vehicles during their mid-course glide phase rather than in the narrow terminal window, would provide a larger engagement window and more favorable geometry. A GPI program is in development and has not yet produced an operationally deployed interceptor. The Conventional Prompt Strike program, the United States' own hypersonic weapon development, deploying from submarines and surface ships, is moving along a parallel track, developing the offensive capability that mirrors what adversaries are building against U.S. forces. Directed energy is the capability that changes the engagement timeline problem in ways that no kinetic interceptor can match. A high-energy laser operating at the speed of light has no flyout time. It has no minimum engagement range. It has no magazine depth limitation in the sense that a missile magazine has one. Its magazine is the ship's electrical generation capacity. The Navy's Helios program, high-energy laser with integrated optical dazzler and surveillance, is currently deployed aboard USS Preble for at-sea testing with operational deployment to the destroyer fleet planned on a timeline that the program office describes with cautious confidence. The AEGIS of the 2030s will need to manage simultaneous threats across the full spectrum: conventional aircraft, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, hypersonic glide vehicles, and drone swarms, with a layered combination of standard missiles, glide phase interceptors, and directed energy systems that no current AEGIS ship carries in its existing configuration. This is the architecture of the next evolution. Not a single new system replacing an old one. A layered capability across multiple intercept mechanisms, managing threats that approach from multiple vectors at multiple velocities, within engagement timelines that compress with each generation of the adversary's investment. The 20mm Oerlikon gunner on USS St. who fired everything he had as the Zero, came in on October 25, 1944, was doing exactly what his training and equipment allowed. He could not do what the situation required, because the situation had outpaced the doctrine that trained him and the technology that armed him. The Navy learned from that. It learned from the kamikaze, from the Soviet saturation scenario, from 1988, from Princeton, from ballistic missile proliferation. Each time, it built something that solved the problem the previous generation couldn't solve. The hypersonic problem is the current generation's reckoning, whether the GPI, Helios, AEGIS Baseline 10, and SPY-6 arrive in time and perform to what the threat demands. That is the question the next decade of American naval engineering investment will answer. The history of this 80-year evolution says the Navy has never faced a threat it did not eventually solve. What history does not guarantee is that the solution arrives before the threat does. Hit the like button and subscribe with the bell icon. This kind of historical depth is what this channel is built for, and there is a lot more coming.